The scream that tore through the healing house was not the sound of a woman giving birth. It was the sound of a woman running for her life. Lyra Ashworth pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the small clinic room, one hand covering her mouth, the other pressed flat against her stomach, as if she could shield the tiny life growing inside her with nothing but her palm. Outside, boots pounded against packed earth. Voices barked orders in low, clipped tones. Someone had come for her, and they had not come to talk. She had known this day might come. She had simply hoped it would come later, after the baby was born, after she had found some way to tell Damon the truth, without putting a target on both their backs. But hope, she was learning very quickly, was a luxury that vanished the moment danger arrived at the door. A shadow crossed the frosted glass window. Lyra's heart slammed against her ribs. She counted the seconds the way her mother had taught her long ago, back before the healing house, back before the pack, back before she had ever imagined loving a king. One breath in, one breath out. Fear had a rhythm if you let it. Fear could be survived if you refused to let it own you. The door handle turned. She moved before she could think, sliding along the wall toward the back window, the one that looked out over the herb garden and, beyond it, the dark tree line that marked the edge of the Crimson Moon territory. Her fingers found the latch. It stuck, swollen from the autumn damp, and for one terrible heartbeat she thought she would be trapped there, in the small room with the dried lavender hanging from the rafters, waiting for whoever was on the other side of that door to find her. Then the latch gave. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet leaves and distant rain. Lyra pulled herself through the narrow window, ignoring the way the wooden frame scraped against her arm, ignoring the ache low in her back that had been bothering her for days. She dropped into the garden, landing hard on her knees among the crushed rosemary, and for one moment she allowed herself to feel it, the full weight of what was happening, the terror of it, before she forced herself back onto her feet. Behind her, the door to the healing room burst open. She heard it splinter against the wall. She did not look back. Looking back had never saved anyone. She ran. The tree line swallowed her whole, branches clawing at her cloak, roots reaching up out of the darkness, as if the forest itself wanted to trip her, to slow her down long enough for the men behind her to catch up. She could hear them now, crashing through the undergrowth, their voices sharper, more urgent. They had realized their prey was faster than expected, or perhaps more desperate. Lyra pressed one hand against the trunk of an ancient oak and forced her breathing to slow, just for a moment, just long enough to think. She was 3 months away from her due date. She was alone. She was being hunted by wolves, who answered to someone with enough power to send them into the healing house of the Crimson Moon Pack itself, deep inside territory that belonged to the most feared Alpha King in the region. Whoever wanted her dead did not fear Damon Voss. That thought alone was enough to make her blood run cold. She thought of him then, just for a heartbeat, the weight of his arm around her shoulders 3 nights ago, the low rumble of his laugh when she had teased him about the way he frowned at paperwork like it had personally wronged him. He did not know about the baby yet. She had wanted to tell him properly, not in a rushed whisper before a council meeting, not in a note left on a pillow. She had wanted flowers, and firelight, and his hand pressed to her stomach when he felt it for the first time. That dream was gone now, torn away as easily as the door behind her had been. A branch snapped somewhere close, too close. Lyra pushed off from the oak and ran again, deeper into the trees, following the slope of the land downward toward the river she knew cut through the eastern edge of the territory. If she could reach the water, she could break her scent trail. If she could break her scent trail, she might live long enough to see morning. Her lungs burned. Her legs, unused to this kind of exertion in her condition, screamed in protest. But she did not stop. She could not stop. Somewhere behind her, a howl rose into the night, sharp and commanding, calling the others to converge. It was not a hunting howl meant to frighten prey. It was a coordinating howl, the kind used by trained trackers who worked as a unit, who had done this before. Lyra reached the river just as the first hint of dawn began to gray the eastern sky. The water was cold, shockingly cold, and it stole the breath from her lungs the moment she stepped into it. She waded in up to her waist, gritting her teeth against the chill, and let the current tug at her cloak as she moved downstream, away from the healing house, away from the packlands, away from everything she had built in the 2 years since she had come to Crimson Moon territory, as a quiet healer, with no family name worth mentioning. She thought about turning back. She thought about running straight to Damon's chambers and telling him everything, throwing herself on his mercy and his strength, letting him gather his warriors and hunt down whoever had sent these men. But even as the thought formed, she knew it was a fantasy born of fear rather than sense. She had overheard enough in the healing house over the past weeks, fragments of conversation from council members who did not realize a healer could listen while she worked, whispers about instability within Damon's own inner circle, about old enemies who had found new footholds among people the king trusted. If someone close to Damon had ordered this, then running to him might not save her. It might only reveal that she and the child she carried were exactly the leverage that someone wanted. The realization settled over her like the cold river water, seeping into every part of her. She could not tell him, not yet. Not until she understood who wanted her gone and why. Not until she could be certain that the truth would not simply hand their enemies a weapon aimed directly at the heart of the Crimson Moon Pack. By the time the sun rose fully over the hills, Lyra had left the river 3 miles downstream from where she entered it, her clothes soaked and heavy, her body trembling from cold and exhaustion. She found an old woodcutter's shelter, abandoned and half collapsed, and she sat inside it with her knees drawn up to her chest, and for the first time since she had heard the boots on the healing house floor, she allowed herself to cry. She cried for the life she was leaving behind. She cried for the man who did not yet know he was going to be a father. She cried for the fear that had already carved itself into her chest, and would not, she suspected, ever fully leave. Then she wiped her face, stood on legs that still shook, and began walking away from everything she had ever known. Miles away, inside the stone walls of the Crimson Moon estate, Damon Voss woke to an empty bed and a silence that felt wrong, in a way he could not immediately name. He reached across the sheets out of habit before his mind fully caught up with his body, expecting to find the warmth of her, the particular way she curled toward him in her sleep, as though even unconscious she wanted to be close. His hand found only cool fabric. He sat up, frowning, telling himself she had likely risen early to tend to a patient, that there was nothing unusual in a healer keeping strange hours. But something in him, some instinct, honed by years of leading a pack through danger and betrayal, refused to settle. He rose, dressed quickly, and made his way through the quiet halls toward the healing house, telling himself the entire way that he was being foolish, that he would find her elbow deep in some tincture, ready to laugh at him for worrying. Instead he found splintered wood, where a door should have been, an open window with fresh scrape marks on the frame, and the unmistakable scent of fear soaked into the floorboards. His wolf rose in him, with a violence that nearly buckled his knees. He gripped the door frame, forcing air into lungs that suddenly felt too small, and for a long, terrible moment, he could not think past the roaring in his ears. Then training took over. He called for his trackers. He called for his second, a steady, sharp-eyed man named Colin, who had served him faithfully for a decade, and together, they moved through the healing house, searching for any sign of what had happened. They found nothing that made sense. No note, no struggle beyond the obvious, no trail that held for more than a few hundred feet before it vanished, swallowed by rain that had begun falling sometime in the early hours. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the night. Colin was the first to voice the thought Damon refused to speak aloud. Perhaps she had left on her own. Perhaps whatever had frightened her had been enough to make her run, and perhaps she had not wanted to be found. Damon rejected the idea instantly, violently, but as the days passed and no ransom demand arrived, no rival pack claimed responsibility, no evidence surfaced of an attack beyond a broken door and a damp scent trail that led nowhere, doubt began to creep in, despite his every effort to keep it out. He searched for 3 weeks straight, barely sleeping, sending trackers in every direction, offering rewards for information, questioning anyone who had spoken to her in the days before she disappeared. He learned nothing. It was as though Lyra Ashworth had never existed at all, as though the 2 years she had spent in his territory, the months she had spent quietly, carefully becoming the center of his entire world, had been nothing more than a dream he had woken from too suddenly. The council, ever practical, ever mindful of the pack's stability, began to speak of moving forward. An Alpha King needed an heir. An Alpha King needed a queen who would stand beside him, not one who had vanished without explanation, leaving nothing but a broken door and a hole in his chest that no amount of searching seemed able to fill. Damon silenced every one of those conversations, with a look that made even his most senior advisors fall quiet. But in the privacy of his own mind, where no one else could see, a small and terrible thought had begun to take root, one he hated himself for entertaining, even as it grew. What if she had simply left him? What if everything between them had been real for her, only as long as it was convenient, and when something had frightened her, some truth about the dangers of loving a king, she had chosen to run rather than face it? He did not know then how wrong that thought was. He did not know that somewhere far beyond his borders, the woman he loved was walking through unfamiliar towns, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child growing inside her, choosing every single day to protect him by staying silent, choosing every single day to carry the weight of a truth so heavy it would have broken most people, all so that the man she loved could rule his people, without becoming a target because of her. He did not know, and for 5 long years, he would not find out. Lyra found work in a town 300 miles from anything she had ever called home, a place called Elwood Cross, where no one asked too many questions of a quiet young woman with careful eyes and steady hands. She told them she was a widow. It was easier than the truth, and in some ways it did not feel entirely like a lie. The man she had loved might as well have been lost to her, separated by distance and danger, as thoroughly as death could have managed. She gave birth in the depths of a hard winter, in a small rented room above a bakery, with only a local midwife named Margaret for company. When the midwife placed the baby in her arms, a girl with a full head of dark hair and eyes that would, within days, settle into a striking shade of gold, Lyra wept again. But this time, the tears were different. This time, they were not only grief. She named her daughter Wren, a small, quiet name for a small, quiet beginning, though nothing about the child would remain quiet for long. From the very first weeks, Wren showed a fierce, curious spirit that reminded Lyra painfully, wonderfully, of her father, though the girl would grow up without ever knowing his name. Lyra built a life in Elwood Cross the way a person builds a shelter in a storm, piece by piece, out of whatever materials came to hand. She used her healing skills to earn a modest living, treating the town's aches and fevers, delivering babies of her own eventually, as her reputation grew. She kept her wolf suppressed as much as she could manage, never shifting, never running under the moon the way her nature demanded, because a wolf's shift could be sensed by anyone with the right training, and she could not risk drawing attention to herself or her daughter. It cost her something, that suppression, a dull ache that lived beneath her skin every single day, a wrongness she had to simply learn to carry. But it was a smaller price than the one she feared paying, if she was ever found. She thought of Daemon every day. She wondered if he had moved on, if he had found someone else to share his throne, if the ache she still carried for him was one he had long since stopped feeling in return. Some nights the wondering nearly undid her, but every morning she woke to Wren's bright eyes and her endless questions, and she reminded herself why she had made the choice she made, and she found the strength to keep going. She did not know, could not have known, that 300 miles away, a king sat alone in a throne room built for 2, still refusing every match his council proposed, still keeping a small drawer in his desk locked shut, still carrying inside him a version of her he had not been able to let go of, no matter how many years passed, no matter how much his advisors insisted that he must. 5 years is a long time. It is long enough to rebuild a life from nothing. It is long enough for a child to grow from a newborn into a bright, sharp-eyed girl who asks why the moon seems to call to something inside her chest, a question Lyra never quite knew how to answer honestly. It is long enough for a broken heart to scar over, though never, it turned out, to heal completely. And it was long enough, in the end, for fate to decide that 5 years of separation was more than enough, and that the truth, no matter how carefully buried, no matter how far it had been carried, was finally ready to be found. Lyra did not know it yet, standing in her small kitchen in Elwood Cross on an ordinary autumn morning, watching Wren chase a stray cat through the garden, with the kind of joyful abandon only a child could manage. She did not know that within the week, a trade dispute 3 towns over would bring a certain Alpha King within a day's ride of her door. She did not know that the life she had so carefully built to protect her daughter was about to collide, without warning, with the very thing she had spent 5 years running from. All she knew, in that quiet moment, was that the air felt different somehow, charged in a way she could not name, the way the sky feels heavy just before a storm breaks, She stood at the window a long moment, one hand pressed flat against the glass, and told herself it was nothing. She was wrong. Wren Ashworth had a habit of asking questions that made adults uncomfortable, and on that particular morning, chasing the neighbor's cat through the frost-touched garden, she was already composing her next one in her mind. She had noticed, over the past several weeks, that her mother's face changed whenever certain words came up in conversation. Words like king, or pack, or father. Her mother's smile would falter for just a moment, before smoothing back into place, quick enough that most people would never notice. But Wren noticed everything. It was, she had decided, one of her best qualities. She gave up on the cat when it disappeared beneath the fence, and instead flopped down onto the cold grass, tipping her head back to watch the clouds drift by. Somewhere inside her chest, she felt a familiar pull, a kind of restlessness that had no obvious cause, a feeling like standing at the edge of something without knowing what. She had felt it most strongly at night, especially on nights when the moon hung full and bright over Elwood Cross. Her mother always kept the shutters closed on those nights, always found some reason to keep Wren busy indoors, and Wren had learned not to ask why, because the answer, whatever it was, clearly cost her mother something to think about. She was 5 years old, but she was not foolish. She understood, in the vague, instinctive way that children understand things before they have words for them, that her family was different, that there was a shape missing from their small household, a shape that should have been there and was not. She had a father somewhere. Everyone did. Her mother had told her, once, gently, that he lived very far away and that it was complicated, and Wren had accepted the answer the way children accept most things adults tell them, with a kind of patient trust that did not fully mask her curiosity. Inside the house, Lyra moved through her morning routine with the ease of long practice, though her mind kept drifting back to that strange, heavy feeling in the air. She told herself it was nothing more than the change of season, the way autumn always seemed to carry a certain electricity before winter settled in fully. She busied her hands preparing a poultice for a patient she would visit later that day, an older man in town who suffered from aching joints whenever the weather turned cold, and she let the familiar work settle her thoughts. She had built a good life here, she reminded herself. Not the life she had once imagined, not the one full of firelight and a king's steady presence beside her, but a good one nonetheless. She had earned the trust of an entire town. She had raised a daughter who was clever and brave and endlessly curious. She had survived 5 years of secrecy, without a single misstep, without a single moment where the careful walls she had built around their lives had cracked. She did not yet know how quickly walls built out of necessity could crumble when the right pressure was applied. 3 towns over, in a settlement called Bridgeholt that sat along the trade road connecting several territories, tensions were rising over a disputed shipment of grain and timber, tensions serious enough that the local council had sent word to several regional authorities requesting mediation. Among those who received the request was the Crimson Moon Pack, whose territory bordered Bridgeholt's trading routes, and whose king, despite his reputation for keeping close to home in recent years, had a personal interest in seeing trade disputes resolved before they escalated into something worse. Damon Voss had changed a great deal in 5 years, though anyone who had known him before would still recognize the sharp lines of his face, the intensity in his gaze that had only grown more pronounced with time. He ruled with a steady, unshakable competence that had earned him respect throughout the region. But those closest to him knew that something in him had gone quiet, in a way that never fully returned. He worked constantly. He slept little. He had never remarried, had never even seriously entertained the matches his counsel continued, with dwindling hope, to suggest. His second, Colin, had watched this transformation over the years with a mixture of admiration and worry. Damon had built the Crimson Moon Pack into one of the strongest territories in the region, had expanded their influence, had strengthened alliances that once seemed impossible. But he had done it, Colin often thought, the way a man builds something to keep his hands busy, so his mind does not have room to wander toward grief. When word came of the dispute in Bridgeholt, Damon volunteered to handle the mediation personally, a decision that surprised several of his advisors, who had grown accustomed to him delegating such matters to trusted representatives. He offered no explanation, beyond a simple statement that the matter required careful handling, and no one pressed him further, though Colin suspected there was more to it than his king was willing to say. Perhaps Damon simply needed a reason to leave the walls of his estate for a while, to put distance between himself and the quiet rooms that still, after 5 years, seemed to echo with an absence he had never learned to fill. The journey to Bridgeholt took 2 days by horseback, through hills turning gold and red with the season, and Damon spent much of it in silence, his mind occupied with the details of the dispute he had been called to settle. It was only as they approached the outskirts of the trade routes near Elwood Cross, a small town he had passed through perhaps once or twice in years past without much notice, that something shifted in him, a strange, unplaceable feeling that made his wolf stir restlessly beneath his skin. He dismissed it as travel weariness. He had learned over the years not to trust every strange feeling that crossed his mind, especially not feelings connected to hope, which had betrayed him too many times in the early years of her disappearance, back when every glimpse of dark hair in a crowd had made his heart lurch painfully, only to reveal, always, a stranger's face. Still, as his party made camp for the night just outside Elwood Cross, waiting for morning before continuing on to Bridgeholt, Damon found himself standing at the edge of the campfire's light, looking toward the small cluster of buildings visible in the distance, unable to shake the feeling that something in that quiet town was waiting for him, though he could not have said what, or why, or how he knew. In Elwood Cross itself, the evening passed as ordinarily as any other. Lyra finished her rounds, checked on the old man with the aching joints, shared a simple dinner with Wren, and settled into the familiar rhythm of bedtime stories and small, quiet conversations that had become the anchor of her days. Wren, as she often did, asked questions that circled, without quite landing, on the shape of the father she had never known. Tonight the questions felt sharper than usual, more insistent, as though some part of the child sensed, the way children sometimes seem to sense things before any evidence presents itself, that the answers she sought were closer than they had ever been. Lyra answered with the same careful, gentle deflections she always used, and eventually Wren drifted off to sleep, her small hand curled loosely around the edge of her blanket. Lyra sat beside her for a long while afterward, watching her daughter's face in the dim candlelight, tracing the familiar shape of a nose, a jawline, features that belonged unmistakably to a man Lyra had not seen in 5 years. She thought, as she often did in these quiet moments, about the choice she had made and whether it had been the right one. She had protected her daughter, certainly, had kept her safe from whatever danger had driven Lyra out of Crimson Moon territory in the first place. But she had also, without meaning to, kept Wren from a father who might have loved her fiercely, who might have given her a life of security and belonging that Lyra, working alone in a small rented house, could never fully provide. The thought brought its usual ache, familiar enough by now that Lyra had learned to sit with it rather than fight it. She blew out the candle, kissed her daughter's forehead, and went to her own bed, unaware that less than a mile away, the man she still dreamed about more nights than she cared to admit, was lying awake beneath an unfamiliar sky, watching the same stars, carrying an ache that mirrored her own almost precisely. Morning came gray and cool, mist clinging low to the fields surrounding Elwood Cross. Damon rose before the rest of his party, restless in a way sleep had not eased, and decided to walk the perimeter of the camp while the others prepared to break for the road. It was during this walk that he found himself drawn, almost against his own will, toward the edge of the town itself, close enough to see smoke rising from chimneys, close enough to hear the distant sounds of a market square coming to life. He told himself he was simply curious, that a king had every reason to observe the small towns that fell within reach of his influence, to understand the people who lived along the trade routes his pack depended on. It was a reasonable explanation, and he clung to it, because the alternative, the strange, insistent pull he felt toward this particular unremarkable town, made no sense at all. He was still turning the thought over in his mind, when a small, bright voice cut through the morning quiet, calling out to someone he could not see, laughing in a way that seemed to fill the entire street with sound. Damon turned toward it without meaning to, some instinct older than thought guiding his attention, and found himself looking at a child. She could not have been more than 5 or 6 years old, dark-haired, quick on her feet, chasing a cat that had apparently decided the market square was more interesting than whatever yard it had escaped from. She moved with a bright, fearless energy that reminded him, with a jolt he could not immediately explain, of someone he had known long ago, though he could not place why a stranger's child would stir such a specific memory. Then she turned, laughing at something, and Damon's entire body went still. Her eyes were gold. Not brown, not hazel, but a striking, unmistakable gold that he had seen exactly once before in his life, in the eyes of a woman he had loved and lost 5 years ago, a color rare enough among wolves that he had never once, in all his years of ruling, seen it duplicated in anyone else. He did not move. He did not breathe. He stood frozen at the edge of the market square, watching a small girl with familiar golden eyes chase a cat through the morning mist, and something deep inside him, something that had gone quiet and cold 5 years ago, and never fully woken since, stirred with a violence that nearly brought him to his knees. He did not yet know her name. He did not yet know whose child she was, or why she carried eyes that should not have existed outside his own memory. But some instinct, ancient and certain, told him that his search, the one he had never truly stopped, even after 5 years of telling himself it was over, had just found its first real thread in half a decade. He followed her. He told himself, even as his feet carried him forward, that he was simply curious, that any reasonable person would want to understand why a child in a small trading town carried such a rare and specific feature. He told himself many things in those first moments, reasonable, careful things, meant to keep the wild hope rising in his chest from overwhelming him entirely. But as he watched the child disappear around a corner, laughing, calling out a name he did not yet know belonged to a mother he had spent 5 years both searching for and trying desperately to forget, Damon Voss understood, with a certainty that settled into his bones like a verdict, that his life was about to change again, just as suddenly and completely as it had the night Lyra Ashworth vanished from his bed and left nothing behind but an open window and a silence he had never learned how to fill. Damon did not confront the child. Even with his heart pounding and his thoughts racing faster than he could organize them, some steady, careful part of him, the part that had ruled a pack for over a decade and learned the value of patience, held him back from doing anything rash. Instead, he watched from a respectful distance as the little girl rounded the corner into a narrow side street, disappearing through the front door of a modest house with pale blue shutters, a house that sat beside a small garden, still holding on to the last of its autumn herbs. He stood there long enough that one of his own men, a tracker named Felix who had ridden with him for years, eventually came looking for him, concerned by his prolonged absence. Damon waved him off with an explanation about surveying the town's layout for trade purposes, an excuse thin enough that Felix clearly did not believe it, though he was wise enough not to press his king for more. Damon spent the rest of that day in a state he could only describe as suspended, his body moving through the motions of the mediation in Bridgeholt, listening to arguments about grain shipments and timber rights, offering judgments that were fair and measured, because his years of experience allowed him to function, even when his mind was elsewhere entirely. But every spare moment, every pause in conversation, every quiet second before sleep took him that night. His thoughts returned to a small house, with pale blue shutters, and a child with golden eyes. He told himself repeatedly that he was building a fantasy out of nothing, that golden eyes, however rare, were not proof of anything beyond coincidence. He told himself that even if the child was somehow connected to Lyra, even if by some impossible twist of fate she had settled in a quiet trading town just beyond his own borders, it did not mean the child was his. 5 years was a long time. People built new lives. People found new loves. The thought sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and unwelcome, but he forced himself to consider it honestly, because he had learned the hard way that hope built on false foundations only made the eventual fall more painful. Still, he could not simply walk away. Whatever the truth turned out to be, he needed to know it. He had spent 5 years living with an absence he never fully understood, and the possibility, however small, that answers might finally be within reach, was not something he could ignore, no matter how carefully he tried to guard himself against disappointment. He extended his stay in the region under the pretense of overseeing the finalized trade agreement, a decision that raised a few eyebrows among his advisors back home, but drew no serious objection, since trade disputes of this nature often required a personal touch to ensure lasting peace between involved parties. In truth, he spent the following 2 days making careful, quiet inquiries about the town of Elwood Cross, about its residents, and specifically, about the woman who lived in the house with pale blue shutters. He learned her name was Elena Ashford, a widowed healer who had arrived in town roughly 5 years earlier, with little more than the clothes on her back, who had built a modest but respected practice, treating the town's various ailments, and who was known for being kind but private, warm with her patients, but reserved about her own history. She had a daughter named Wren, born not long after her arrival in Elwood Cross, and the two of them lived quietly, without much family or connection beyond the town itself. The name Elena Ashford meant nothing to him, but something about the surname Ashford, so close to the name he remembered, so deliberately altered in a way that suggested someone trying to hide in plain sight rather than vanish entirely, sent a fresh wave of certainty through him. And the timeline, a woman arriving 5 years ago, a daughter born not long after, matched with a precision that made his chest tighten, with something he was almost afraid to name. He made his decision that evening, sitting alone in the small room he had rented above Bridgeholt's only inn, staring at a cup of untouched tea gone cold in front of him. He would go to Elwood Cross. He would see this woman for himself, and if she was who he suspected, if fate had truly delivered her back into his path, after 5 years of searching and grieving, and slowly, painfully learning to live without her, then he would have answers, whatever those answers turned out to be, even if they broke him all over again. He rode into Elwood Cross alone the following morning, leaving his men behind in Bridgeholt, with instructions to finalize the last details of the trade agreement without him. It was not a decision his advisors would have approved of, a king traveling without escort into unfamiliar territory, but Damon had not survived a decade of rule by being reckless, and something in him understood that whatever he was about to face required privacy, not an audience. The town was quiet in the early morning light, market stalls just beginning to open, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery on the corner. Damon dismounted near the edge of the square and walked the rest of the way on foot, his heart beating harder with each step than it had during any battle he could remember. He found the house easily enough, its pale blue shutters exactly as he remembered from 2 days before. He stood at the small wooden gate for a long moment, one hand resting on the latch, gathering himself the way he might, before walking into a room full of hostile council members, though this felt infinitely more dangerous than any political confrontation he had ever faced. He knocked before he could talk himself out of it. There was a pause, footsteps approaching from inside, and then the door opened, and Damon Voss found himself looking, for the first time in 5 years, into the face of the woman he had never stopped loving, no matter how hard he had tried. Lyra's expression shifted through several emotions in the span of a single heartbeat, shock giving way to something that looked almost like relief before settling, finally, into a wary, guarded stillness that Damon recognized immediately as fear, though whether that fear was for herself or for something else entirely, he could not yet tell. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The morning air between them felt thick, charged with 5 years of unanswered questions, and Damon found that every carefully rehearsed thing he had planned to say had abandoned him completely, leaving him standing there simply staring at her, drinking in the sight of a face he had feared he might never see again. She looked older, though not in a way that diminished her, the years having simply sharpened something in her expression, added a kind of watchfulness that had not been there before. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and she wore the plain, practical clothing of a working healer, nothing like the woman who had once stood beside him in council meetings, dressed in the fine fabrics befitting a future queen. And yet she was, unmistakably, undeniably, the woman he had spent 5 years trying and failing to forget. It was Lyra who finally broke the silence, her voice tight, careful, the voice of someone choosing every word with enormous caution. "You should not be here," she said. The words hit him harder than he expected, not because they surprised him, but because they confirmed something he had been afraid to fully believe, until that exact moment. She had recognized him instantly. She had not looked at him with the confusion of a stranger, or the polite distance of someone who had simply moved on and forgotten. She had looked at him the way a person looks at a ghost they had spent years trying to bury. "I have spent 5 years looking for you," Damon said, his voice rougher than he intended, carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every failed search, every moment of doubt he had battled and buried and battled again. "I deserve to know why you left." Something flickered across Lyra's face, pain, guilt, an old and familiar grief that had clearly never fully faded despite the years. She glanced quickly behind her, into the house, before stepping outside and pulling the door mostly closed behind her, as though protecting whoever was inside from whatever conversation was about to unfold. "It is not safe to speak of this here," she said quietly. "Please, Damon, you need to leave. For your own sake and for mine." He did not move. 5 years of grief and confusion had hardened into something unshakable, and he was not about to walk away now, not after finally finding her, not without answers, no matter how carefully she tried to steer him away. "I am not leaving," he said simply. "Not until you tell me the truth." Lyra opened her mouth, likely to argue further, likely to find some new careful excuse to send him away, but before she could speak, the door behind her creaked open, and a small voice, bright and curious, cut through the tension between them. "Mama, who is that?" Damon's gaze shifted past Lyra to the child standing in the doorway, the same girl he had watched chasing a cat through the market square 2 days earlier, her golden eyes wide with open curiosity, as she looked between her mother and the stranger standing at their gate. Up close, in the clear morning light, the resemblance was undeniable, not just in the color of her eyes but in the shape of her jaw, the particular tilt of her chin when she was trying to work something out, features that Damon recognized because he saw them every morning when he looked in a mirror. The world seemed to tilt beneath him. He heard Lyra say his name, sharp with warning, but the sound barely registered over the roaring in his ears as he stared at the child, at his child, standing in a doorway in a town he had never once thought to search, 5 years after he had been told, in every way except words, that the mother of this child had simply left him without a backward glance. The girl, apparently undeterred by the tension crackling in the air around her, stepped fully into the doorway and studied Damon, with the frank, assessing gaze of a child who had not yet learned to hide her curiosity. Her eyes moved from his face to Lyra's, back and forth, piecing together something in her own mind with the quick, intuitive logic that children often possessed, and adults had long since trained themselves out of. Then she asked the question that would change everything. "Mama, is that my daddy?" For a long moment, no one moved. The question hung in the cold morning air, simple and devastating in a way only a child's honesty could manage, stripping away every careful evasion Lyra had spent 5 years constructing. Damon felt something crack open inside his chest, a wave of emotion so overwhelming he could not immediately separate one feeling from another. There was joy, fierce and sudden, at the confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect. There was grief, sharp and old, for 5 years lost, that could never be returned to him, and beneath both of those, there was anger, quiet but unmistakable, directed not at the child, never at the child, but at the circumstances that had kept this truth buried for so long. Lyra knelt quickly, drawing Wren gently against her side, her hand smoothing over the girl's dark hair, in a gesture that was as much for her own comfort as for her daughter's. Her eyes met Damon's over the top of Wren's head, pleading with him silently for patience, for understanding, for a chance to explain before everything shattered completely. "Wren, sweetheart," Lyra said carefully, "why don't you go inside and finish your breakfast? I need to speak with this man for a moment." "But Mama," Wren protested, her golden eyes still fixed on Damon with open fascination. "He has the same eyes as me. Well, almost. Mine are more gold. His are more brown around the edges, but still." Despite the tension crackling through every part of his body, Damon felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward, a strange, involuntary response to the matter-of-fact way his daughter had just catalogued their shared features, as though she were comparing 2 flowers in a garden. It was such a small thing, and yet it undid something in him completely. The casual, unguarded way she spoke, the complete absence of fear in her expression, even as the adults around her radiated tension thick enough to choke on. "Wren," Lyra said again, more firmly this time, though her voice trembled slightly. "Inside, please." The girl huffed a small put-upon sigh that was so achingly familiar in its rhythm, so exactly the sound Lyra herself used to make when asked to do something she found unreasonable, that Damon felt his chest tighten all over again. But she obeyed, disappearing back into the house, with one last curious glance thrown over her shoulder, leaving her mother, and the stranger with familiar eyes, alone in the cold morning air. The moment the door clicked shut, Lyra straightened, and the composed, careful mask she had been wearing cracked entirely, revealing 5 years of exhaustion and fear and grief all at once. She pressed a hand to her mouth, and for a moment, Damon thought she might simply collapse under the weight of everything she had clearly been carrying alone. He stepped forward instinctively, wanting to reach for her the way he once had without a second thought, but stopped himself, uncertain now what he was allowed to do, uncertain what 5 years and a hidden child had changed between them. "I need you to explain," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier demand, replaced with something closer to desperate pleading. "I need you to tell me why you left, why you never told me, why I have spent 5 years believing you simply walked away from everything we had, from everything I thought we were building together." Lyra's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her all at once, replaced by a weariness so profound it seemed to age her right in front of him. "Not here," she said finally. "Please, come inside. It is time you knew everything, and I would rather you hear it sitting down than standing in the street where anyone might overhear." She led him through the small house, past a modest sitting room with worn but comfortable furniture, past a kitchen, where a bowl of half-finished porridge sat abandoned on the table, and into a back room that served as her study, shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and carefully labeled remedies, evidence of a life built entirely around the same healing skills she had once practiced in his own territory. Ren, apparently sensing that the adults needed privacy, had retreated to her own room, though Damon suspected the girl was likely listening at the door with the same fierce curiosity she had shown at the gate. Lyra gestured for him to sit, and when he did not, choosing instead to stand near the window with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, she sank into the chair behind her desk, folding her hands together as though bracing herself for what came next. "I did not leave you because I wanted to," she began, her voice steady now, though Damon could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "I left because someone came for me, in the healing house, the same night I discovered I was carrying our child. I did not run away from you, Damon. I ran to survive, and I kept running because I believed, with everything in me, that staying away was the only way to keep both you and our daughter safe." Damon's jaw tightened, old grief and fresh fury warring inside him in equal measure. "Someone came for you," he repeated slowly, "inside my own territory. And you never told me." "I could not," Lyra said, her eyes finally meeting his fully. "Whoever sent them knew things they should not have known. They knew the layout of the healing house. They knew which room I would be in. It felt, even in the chaos of that night, like the kind of knowledge that could only come from someone close to you, someone with access to your inner circle. I did not know who to trust. I did not know if telling you would put you in danger, or worse, if it would put our unborn child directly into the hands of whoever wanted us gone." The words settled over him like a physical weight, each one confirming a fear he had carried quietly for 5 years without ever fully allowing himself to examine it. The fear that something had gone wrong within his own walls, that the mystery of Lyra's disappearance had never truly been solved because he had never truly looked in the right direction. "You believed someone in my own council wanted you dead," he said slowly, testing the shape of the words even as he spoke them. "I believed," Lyra said, "that I could not risk finding out the hard way. I was 3 months pregnant, Damon. I was alone, and frightened, and the only thing I could think clearly enough to do was run far enough and fast enough that whoever wanted me gone would believe they had succeeded, and would stop looking for a threat that no longer seemed to exist." Damon turned away from her, staring out the window at the small garden beyond, his mind racing through 5 years of memories, searching for anything, any conversation, any suspicious behavior among his advisors that might have hinted at the kind of betrayal Lyra was describing. He found pieces, now that he was looking for them, small inconsistencies he had dismissed at the time as unimportant, moments of tension within his council that he had chalked up to ordinary political friction rather than something far more sinister. "Why did you never send word?" he asked finally, "once you were safe? Once you had put enough distance between yourself and whatever danger you were fleeing? Why let me believe, for 5 entire years, that you had simply abandoned me?" Lyra's voice cracked slightly when she answered, the first real fissure in her composure since he had arrived. "Because I did not know if it was ever truly safe," she said. "Because every time I considered reaching out, I imagined what might happen if the message was intercepted, if whoever wanted us gone learned that we were still alive, still findable. I told myself I was protecting you by staying silent, that a grieving king who believed his lover had simply left him was safer, more stable, than one who knew the truth and might tear his own council apart searching for a traitor who could strike again at any moment. I told myself Ren was safer as an ordinary child in an ordinary town than as a hidden heir who might be hunted for the rest of her life if her existence became known. She paused, drawing a shaking breath before continuing, quieter now, more raw. I do not know if I made the right choice, Damon. I have asked myself that question every single day for 5 years, but I made the only choice that felt, at the time, like it gave our daughter any chance at a normal, safe life. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am only asking you to understand that I never stopped loving you, and I never once made this choice lightly. Damon stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing everything she had said, feeling the shape of 5 years of assumed betrayal, slowly reforming into something far more complicated. A story not of abandonment, but of sacrifice. Of a woman who had carried an impossible burden alone, rather than risk the people she loved most. The anger did not disappear entirely. It could not after 5 years of grief that had shaped so much of who he had become. But beneath it, something else was rising. Something fierce and protective, and entirely certain. A resolve that settled into his chest with the weight of an oath. Whoever did this, he said quietly, turning back to face her, will answer for it. I promise you that. But first, I need you to understand something equally certain. I am not walking away from you again. Not from you, and not from our daughter. Whatever danger drove you into hiding 5 years ago, we will face it together this time. You will never have to carry this alone again. Lyra looked up at him, and for the first time since he had arrived at her gate, something like hope flickered across her exhausted features, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably present. It will not be simple, she said softly. Whoever wanted us gone may still be out there. Coming home with you means putting Ren directly back into whatever danger I spent 5 years running from. I know, Damon said, and I intend to make certain that whoever they are, they will not get the chance to threaten either of you again. Outside the study door, unseen by either adult, a small figure with golden eyes had indeed been listening, absorbing far more of the conversation than either parent realized, and forming, in her own quick and determined mind, a fierce and unshakable resolve of her own. Whatever danger her parents were speaking of, whatever shadow had kept her father a stranger for the first 5 years of her life, Ren decided, with the simple, uncomplicated certainty of a child who had just found something precious, that she was not about to let it take him away again. The decision to return to Crimson Moon territory was not one Lyra made lightly, and it took the better part of a week, filled with careful conversations late into the night after Ren had gone to sleep, before she finally agreed to it. Damon understood her hesitation completely. She had spent 5 years building an elaborate wall of safety around herself and her daughter, and now he was asking her to tear it down entirely, to walk back into the exact danger she had once fled, trusting that this time, the outcome would be different. What finally convinced her was not any promise Damon made about safety, though he made many, but rather a quiet observation he offered on the 6th night of his stay in Elwood Cross, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table long after Ren had gone to bed. You have spent 5 years protecting her from a threat that may not even exist anymore, he said gently. But you have also spent 5 years keeping her from a home, a family, an entire heritage that belongs to her by right. At some point, the danger of staying hidden may become greater than the danger of coming forward, especially if whoever wanted you gone believes, even now, that you succeeded in disappearing completely. The moment they realize otherwise, hiding will no longer protect you. Only strength will. Lyra had not answered immediately, turning the words over in her mind long after Damon had retired to the small guest room she had reluctantly offered him, unwilling to send him back out into the cold when the alternative felt, suddenly and surprisingly, less frightening than she had expected. She thought of Ren, of the restless energy that lived in her daughter's small body, the way the girl's wolf had begun stirring more insistently in recent months, as she approached the age where her first shift would need to be guided by someone who understood the process fully. Lyra had done her best, drawing on her own training as a healer, but she was not equipped to teach a child of royal bloodline everything she would need to know as she grew. By morning, she had made her decision. They would return to Crimson Moon territory, but carefully, and on her own terms. The journey took 4 days, traveling at a measured pace that accounted for Ren's smaller stride and frequent need for rest, though the girl herself seemed to find the entire adventure thrilling rather than tiring. peppering both her parents with an endless stream of questions about the pack she was about to meet, the castle she would apparently be living in, and whether or not there would be other children her age to play with. Damon found himself, somewhere during those 4 days, falling into an easy rhythm with his daughter that surprised him with how natural it felt, as though some part of him had simply been waiting 5 years for the chance to know her. He taught her small things as they traveled, the names of birds they passed, simple lessons about tracking and terrain that she absorbed with startling quickness, and in the evenings, around the campfire, he told her stories about the pack she would soon call home, careful to leave out anything that might frighten her, focusing instead on the traditions and celebrations that made Crimson Moon territory feel less like an unknown danger and more like a place worth looking forward to. Lyra watched these interactions with an ache in her chest that was equal parts joy and grief. Joy at finally seeing the bond she had always hoped her daughter might have with her father, and grief for the 5 years that bond had been denied to both of them through no fault of their own. When they finally arrived at the edge of Crimson Moon territory, Damon sent word ahead so that his return, and the unprecedented nature of who accompanied him, would not come as a complete shock to his council and his people. He chose his words carefully in that message, revealing enough to prepare his advisors for what was coming, without giving away details that might reach the wrong ears, before he had a chance to investigate the matter properly. Colin met them at the border, and the look on his second's face when he laid eyes on Lyra, standing beside Damon with a small golden-eyed girl clutching her hand, was one Damon would remember for a long time afterward, a complicated mixture of shock, relief, and dawning understanding that seemed to shift something fundamental in the loyal man's worldview. "They found her," Colin said quietly, more statement than question, his gaze moving between Lyra and the child at her side. "She found herself," Damon corrected, a note of quiet pride entering his voice despite the seriousness of the moment. "And she has been protecting our daughter alone for 5 years. That ends now." The return to the estate itself was, in many ways, more difficult than the journey had been. Word had spread quickly through the pack, and by the time their small party reached the castle gates, a crowd had gathered, drawn by curiosity and disbelief in equal measure. Lyra felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, remembering, with a fresh pang of old anxiety, the whispers that had likely circulated in the years following her disappearance, speculation about a woman who had abandoned her king without explanation. Damon, sensing her tension, reached for her hand without hesitation, lacing his fingers through hers in front of the entire gathered crowd, a public gesture that left no room for doubt about where he stood. Whatever the pack believed about the past, his actions now made his position unmistakably clear. The formal explanation would come later, delivered carefully to the full council in a private session where Lyra recounted, with Damon's steady presence beside her, the events of that terrible night 5 years ago, and everything that had followed. The council received the news with a range of reactions, shock and sympathy from most, though Damon noticed, with the sharp, careful attention of a man now actively searching for betrayal among his own ranks, that a few faces in the room reacted with something closer to unease than surprise. He filed those observations away carefully, saying nothing in the moment, but resolving privately to watch those particular council members with renewed scrutiny in the days ahead. The following weeks settled into a strange, delicate new normal. Wren adjusted to castle life with the same fearless enthusiasm she brought to everything, quickly charming the household staff and beginning tentative friendships with a handful of pack children close to her age. Lyra resumed her healing work, though now within the walls of the estate's own healing house, the very building she had fled from 5 years earlier, a return that carried its own quiet weight of significance each time she crossed its threshold. Damon, meanwhile, began the careful, methodical work of investigating what had happened that night, treating the matter with the same patient thoroughness he applied to every serious threat against his pack. He started by revisiting the original search records from 5 years ago, cross-referencing them against the current roster of his council and senior staff, searching for anyone whose position, access, or behavior around that time raised questions worth pursuing. He brought Colin fully into his confidence, trusting his second's judgment and loyalty without reservation, and together, they began quietly interviewing longtime staff members who had been present during the original incident, asking careful questions designed to jog forgotten memories without revealing the full scope of the investigation to anyone who might carry word back to whoever had orchestrated the attack. Slowly, Painstakingly, a picture began to emerge. Several staff members recalled unusual activity around the healing house in the days before Lyra's disappearance, deliveries that did not match any records, a visitor whose face no one could quite remember clearly, as though the memory itself had been deliberately obscured. One elderly healer, now retired but still living within the territory, recalled a conversation overheard shortly before the attack, fragments of a discussion about the king's growing attachment to a woman without proper pack lineage, and how such an attachment might complicate certain long-standing plans. The word plans struck Damon with particular weight, and he pressed the retired healer for more detail, though her memory of the specifics had faded considerably with time. Still, it was enough to confirm what Lyra had suspected from the very beginning. Whoever had ordered the attack had done so not out of random malice, but as part of some larger scheme, one connected, perhaps, to questions of succession and power within the pack itself. The investigation deepened his suspicion toward a particular faction within his council, a group of older, traditionally minded advisors who had never fully embraced Lyra's presence in the pack even before her disappearance, viewing her lack of noble bloodline as a liability to the stability and prestige of Crimson Moon territory. Damon had always considered their objections a matter of old-fashioned prejudice rather than genuine threat, but now, looking back with new eyes, he began to wonder if that prejudice had curdled into something far more dangerous. He said nothing of his suspicions publicly, careful not to tip his hand before he had gathered enough evidence to act with certainty. But he watched, he listened, and slowly, he began to notice patterns, subtle alliances, and quiet conversations among certain council members that he had never paid particular attention to before, but which now seemed to form the outline of something coordinated, something that had perhaps never fully stopped operating in the shadows, even after its initial attempt on Lyra's life had failed. Lyra, for her part, threw herself into helping the investigation wherever she could, drawing on her own memories of that terrible night and the weeks leading up to it, memories she had spent 5 years trying to forget, but now forced herself to examine closely, searching for any detail that might help identify who had wanted her gone. It was during one of these careful review sessions, late one evening in Damon's private study with Colin present as well, that Lyra recalled something she had never mentioned before, a detail so small she had genuinely forgotten it until the careful process of reconstruction brought it back to the surface. There was a scent, she said slowly, working to pull the memory into sharper focus. On the night of the attack, beneath the fear and the chaos, I remember catching a scent I recognized, just for a moment, before I lost it in the rain. I did not think of it again until now, because at the time I assumed it was simply someone from the pack helping to search for me. But looking back, I do not think that is what it was at all. Damon leaned forward, his attention razor-sharp. "Whose scent?" he asked. Lyra closed her eyes, concentrating, pulling the fragment of memory forward through 5 years of deliberate forgetting. "I believe," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet Damon's steady gaze, "it belonged to someone close to you. Someone I would have trusted completely, at the time, to be on our side." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over all three of them, and Damon felt a cold, familiar fury beginning to build in his chest, the same fury that had driven him through 5 years of grief and searching, now sharpening into something focused and purposeful. If Lyra's instincts were correct, the traitor who had torn his family apart for 5 long years was not some distant enemy operating from the shadows of a rival territory. The traitor was someone who had likely stood beside him at council meetings, someone who had perhaps even offered him quiet, false sympathy in the aftermath of Lyra's disappearance, all while knowing exactly what had truly happened and why. The reckoning, Damon understood in that moment, was going to be far closer to home than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. The peace of the following weeks did not last. It rarely does, in a household guarding a secret as dangerous as the one Damon and Lyra now shared, and the first sign that their carefully quiet investigation had drawn unwanted attention came on a clear evening, nearly a month after their return, when Wren failed to come inside for dinner at her usual time. Lyra noticed first, glancing up from the stew she was preparing to find the kitchen doorway empty, where her daughter should have been standing, impatiently announcing her hunger the way she did every single evening without fail. A small, cold thread of unease wound through her chest, the same instinct that had once saved her life 5 years earlier, now rising sharply to the surface. She found the back garden empty too, the small wooden swing Damon had built for Wren swaying gently in the evening breeze, abandoned mid-motion, as though someone had left it in a hurry. Lyra's heart began to pound. "Wren!" she called, her voice already carrying an edge of panic she could not fully suppress. "Wren, where are you?" Silence answered her, broken only by the rustle of wind through the garden hedges, and Lyra felt 5 years of carefully suppressed terror come rushing back all at once. The memory of boots on floorboards, of a door splintering open, of running through dark trees with her heart in her throat. She did not hesitate. She ran through the castle grounds, calling for help, her voice carrying enough urgency that guards and staff members alike abandoned their posts to join the search, spreading out across the estate grounds with a speed and coordination that spoke to how seriously the entire household had come to regard the safety of their king's newly discovered daughter. Damon arrived within minutes, having been summoned from a council meeting by a frantic young guard, and the moment he took in Lyra's face, white with terror, he understood immediately that this was no simple case of a child wandering off to explore. His wolf rose instantly, sharp and dangerous beneath his skin, and he began issuing orders with the crisp, controlled authority of a king who had led search efforts before and knew exactly how quickly they needed to move. The search covered the castle grounds first, then expanded outward toward the surrounding forest as the last light of evening began to fade into darkness. It was Colin who found the first clue. A small scrap of fabric caught on a low branch at the edge of the tree line, torn from the pale yellow dress Wren had been wearing that morning. Beyond it, faint but unmistakable to trained noses, a trail of scent led deeper into the forest, mixed with something else, something sharp and unfamiliar, that made every wolf who caught it bristle with instinctive alarm. "Strangers," Colin said grimly, kneeling to examine the ground more closely. "At least 2, maybe 3, and they moved fast." Damon felt something cold and absolute settle over him, the particular calm that came, he had learned over years of leadership, not from an absence of fear, but from fear channeled entirely into purpose. He turned to Lyra, who stood pale and trembling beside him, and though every instinct told him to comfort her, he knew there was no time for anything except action. "Stay here," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging beneath it. "Coordinate with the healers, in case anyone is injured when we return. I will bring her home." Lyra shook her head fiercely, her fear transforming visibly into fierce, protective determination. "I am coming with you," she said. "I have spent 5 years running from this exact danger. I will not sit here and wait while someone else decides whether my daughter lives or dies." Damon looked at her for a long moment, recognizing in her expression the same unshakable resolve that had once kept her alive and kept their daughter safe through 5 years of hiding, and he understood that arguing would waste precious time neither of them could afford. "Then stay close to me," he said instead, "and do exactly as I say." The trail led them deep into the forest, following the scent Colin had identified, moving as quickly as the darkening woods allowed. Damon's wolf pressed hard against his skin, urging him toward violence, toward speed, but he forced himself to move with careful precision rather than reckless haste, aware that a mistake now could cost his daughter her life. They found the group nearly an hour later, gathered in a small clearing lit by a single lantern, 3 men Damon did not recognize standing over a small, defiant figure who sat with her arms crossed and her chin raised, despite the tears tracking down her face, refusing, even in obvious fear, to give her captors the satisfaction of seeing her break completely. Wren, Lyra's whispered gasp beside him, carried both relief and renewed terror in equal measure. Damon assessed the situation in the span of a single heartbeat, noting the positions of the 3 men, the distance between them and his daughter, the layout of the small clearing that might work either for or against a rescue attempt. He raised a hand, signaling for Lyra and the handful of guards who had caught up with them to hold their position, while he moved forward alone, choosing words over immediate violence, at least for the first crucial moments. "That is enough," he said, stepping into the clearing with a calm authority that belied the fury boiling beneath his controlled exterior. "Release my daughter, and we can discuss whatever grievance brought you into my territory without further bloodshed." The 3 men startled at his sudden appearance, exchanging quick, uncertain glances that told Damon immediately they had not expected to be found so quickly. Nor had they expected the king himself to arrive, rather than a search party of guards. One of them, older and clearly in charge of the small group, stepped forward with a sneer that did little to hide the nervous tension in his posture. "We were told the girl was unclaimed," he said. "A loose thread from an old mistake, easily removed without consequence. It seems our information was outdated." Damon's fury sharpened at the casual, dismissive way the man spoke of his daughter, an innocent child, as though she were nothing more than an inconvenient detail to be erased. But he kept his voice level, focused on drawing out information, even as he calculated the fastest path to ending the confrontation without harm coming to Ren. "Who sent you?" he asked. The man's sneer widened slightly, though something flickered behind his eyes that looked almost like uncertainty. "Someone who wanted a clean end to an old problem," he said. "Someone who has been very patient and very careful for 5 long years." It was Ren, small and furious in the center of the clearing, who broke the tension, in a way none of the adults expected. Taking advantage of her captor's attention being fixed on Damon, she twisted sharply in the grip of the man holding her, driving her elbow hard into his side, with a strength that surprised him enough to loosen his grip, and in that single moment of opportunity, she bolted, small legs carrying her across the clearing, directly toward her father, with a speed born of pure determination. The clearing erupted into chaos. Damon surged forward to meet his daughter halfway, sweeping her up and pivoting his body to shield her instinctively, as the 3 men, realizing their leverage had just vanished, scrambled between fighting and fleeing. Guards poured into the clearing from the tree line, and Lyra, unable to hold back any longer, rushed forward the moment Ren was safely in Damon's arms, wrapping both of them in a fierce embrace that shook with the force of her relief. 2 of the 3 attackers were subdued quickly, overwhelmed by the sudden arrival of Damon's guards, but the older man, the one who had spoken, used the chaos to slip backward into the tree line, disappearing into the darkness before anyone could stop him. Damon made the split-second decision to let him go, rather than risk his men in a chase through unfamiliar darkness, choosing instead to focus every resource on getting his daughter and Lyra safely back to the castle. There would be time, he told himself grimly, holding both the people he loved most in the world close against him, to hunt down the man who had escaped, and through him, to finally uncover the identity of whoever had been orchestrating this threat from the shadows for 5 long, patient years. That night, once Ren had been checked over by the healing house staff and pronounced physically unharmed, though understandably shaken, and once she had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep with Lyra sitting beside her bed refusing to leave her side, Damon retreated to his study, with the 2 captured attackers under heavy guard elsewhere in the castle, ready to be questioned at first light. He stood alone at his window for a long time, staring out at the dark grounds where his daughter had nearly been taken from him before he had even had the chance to fully know her, and he understood, with absolute clarity, that the time for careful, quiet investigation had come to an end. Whoever was behind this had grown bold enough to strike within his own territory, close enough to his own walls to prove that no amount of hiding or careful secrecy would keep his family safe for long. The traitor, whoever they were, needed to be found, and they needed to be found soon. The interrogation began at dawn, conducted in a private chamber deep within the castle, where Damon, Colin, and 2 of the king's most trusted guards questioned the 2 captured attackers separately, hoping that isolation and the passage of a long, uncertain night might loosen tongues that had remained stubbornly silent during the initial questioning immediately after their capture. The younger of the 2 men broke first, his nerve failing him sometime around mid-morning, after hours of careful, patient pressure from Colin, who had a particular talent for making silence feel more uncomfortable than confession. He admitted, eventually, that he and his companions had been hired through an intermediary, never meeting the person who had ultimately ordered the attack, paid a substantial sum to eliminate what they had been told was a loose end from an old, forgotten conflict. He did not know the true identity of whoever had hired them. He knew only that the instructions had come through a series of careful, anonymous messages, and that payment had been delivered through a trusted courier service that operated along several trade routes, including, Damon noted grimly, the very route that connected his territory to Bridgeholt, where the original trade dispute had drawn him close enough to Elwood Cross to find his daughter in the first place. The coincidence, if it even was one, sat uneasily with Damon. It suggested a level of ongoing surveillance he had not fully appreciated. Someone who had perhaps known, or at least suspected, that Lyra and Ren were living within reach of his territory for far longer than the mere weeks since his discovery of them. Someone patient enough to wait for the right moment to strike, rather than acting impulsively the instant a threat presented itself. The older attacker, the second man captured, proved more resistant to questioning, but Damon's patience, worn thin by the previous night's terror, had grown considerably shorter, and by early afternoon, faced with the certainty of severe consequences for continued silence, and the possibility of leniency in exchange for cooperation, the man finally offered a single piece of information that changed the entire direction of the investigation. "The courier who delivered our payments," he said, "wore the crest of your own household staff, sewn discreetly into the lining of his cloak, visible only if you knew to look for it. I assumed at the time it meant our employer had connections within your castle. I did not think much of it beyond that, until now." Damon felt the information settle into place with the cold, certain click of a lock finally turning, confirming what he and Lyra had already begun to suspect from her recovered memory of a familiar scent on the night of the original attack. Whoever had orchestrated this campaign against his family was not merely connected to his household, they were embedded within it, close enough to access courier services reserved for the castle's most trusted staff. He called an immediate, private meeting with Colin, laying out everything they had learned and cross-referencing it once again against the list of staff and council members who had access to the household courier network, a list that, fortunately, was considerably shorter than the full roster of everyone within the castle walls. It was Colin, working through the list with the same methodical care he brought to every task Damon assigned him, who finally landed on a name that made both men go very still. "Edmund Farrow," Colin said slowly, reading from the list of authorized courier users. "He has held a position on your council for nearly 15 years. He served your father before you. He was among the first to express concern about your relationship with Lyra, all those years ago, though he was hardly alone in that at the time." Damon's mind raced back through years of memory, sorting through countless interactions with Edmund Farrow, a quiet, unassuming man who had never drawn particular attention to himself, who had offered careful, measured counsel in council meetings, and had, Damon now recalled with a fresh chill, been among the advisors present at the very meeting 5 years ago where the council had first begun pressuring him to consider a more suitable match after Lyra's disappearance. He never seemed the type, Damon said, though even as he spoke the words, he recognized their emptiness. He had learned, over years of leadership, that the most dangerous traitors were rarely the obvious ones. They confronted Edmund Farrow that same evening, though carefully, without immediately revealing the full extent of what they had uncovered, inviting him to a private meeting, under the pretense of discussing ongoing security concerns following the previous night's attack on Ren. Damon watched the older man closely as he entered the study, searching for any flicker of guilt or nervousness that might confirm his suspicions before a single accusation had even been spoken. Edmund seemed, at first, entirely composed, expressing appropriate concern about the attack and offering measured suggestions about strengthening the castle's perimeter security, the exact sort of careful, practical counsel he had offered for 15 years without incident. It was only when Damon, watching closely, mentioned the courier network almost casually, framing it as a potential vulnerability worth reviewing, that something in Edmund's expression shifted, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that a less attentive observer might have missed entirely. "We have reason to believe," Damon continued, keeping his voice level and measured despite the fury building steadily beneath his calm exterior, "that whoever ordered the attack on my daughter used our own courier network to arrange payment. Someone with authorized access. Someone trusted enough within this household to move messages and funds without drawing suspicion." Edmund's composure cracked slightly, though he attempted, with visible effort, to maintain his careful mask. "That is troubling news indeed," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness. "I will begin reviewing the courier logs immediately to help identify whoever might be responsible." "That will not be necessary," Colin said quietly, stepping forward from where he had been standing near the door. "We have already reviewed them, extensively." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Damon could hear his own heartbeat, watching Edmund Farrow's face, as the older man seemed to age visibly in the span of a few seconds. The careful mask finally, completely falling away, to reveal something far more complicated underneath. A mixture of resignation, old resentment, and a strange, weary relief that spoke to the exhaustion of maintaining a lie for as long as he apparently had. "You do not understand what was at stake," Edmund said finally, his voice quiet but no longer attempting to deny anything. "Your father built this pack on the foundation of proper bloodlines, careful alliances, generations of tradition. When you chose a healer with no family name, no political value, no connections that could strengthen our territory, you threatened everything he built. I tried, for years, to guide you back toward a more suitable path through proper counsel. When that failed, when I realized you intended to make her your queen regardless of the consequences to this pack's stability, I concluded that more drastic measures were necessary." Daemon's hands curled into fists at his sides, restraining, with enormous effort, the violent response his wolf demanded in the face of such a calm, chilling confession. "You tried to have her killed," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "while she carried my child. And when that failed, you spent 5 years waiting, patient enough to let me grieve, to let me search and fail and slowly give up hope, all while you sat beside me in council meetings offering false comfort." "I did what I believed necessary to protect this pack," Edmund said, though even he seemed to hear how hollow the justification sounded now, spoken aloud in the face of the damage it had caused. "I see now that I was wrong about many things. I did not anticipate that she would survive, that she would raise your child successfully in hiding, that fate would bring you back together despite everything I did to prevent it." Daemon studied the man who had once been counted among his trusted advisors, feeling the full weight of 5 years of stolen time settle over him. Grief and rage tangled together in a way that left little room for anything resembling mercy. And yet, even in his fury, some part of him, the part shaped by years of careful, measured leadership, understood that the situation required judgment rather than pure vengeance, especially with his daughter's safety and his pack's stability still very much at stake. "You will be held for formal judgment before the full council," he said finally, his voice regaining its steady, commanding authority. "And you will provide every detail of your operation, every accomplice, every remaining thread of this conspiracy, so that I can ensure my family is never threatened by this again. Whether you receive mercy or the full weight of pack law will depend entirely on your cooperation from this moment forward." Edmund Farrow, faced finally with the complete collapse of everything he had spent 5 years carefully protecting, offered no further resistance, providing, over the following days, a detailed account of his actions, the intermediaries he had used, the funds he had diverted, and, crucially, confirmation that the man who had escaped the previous night's confrontation in the forest had been his final hired agent, someone who would now, Daemon suspected, be running as far and as fast from Crimson Moon territory as possible, aware that his employer's identity had been exposed. The confession, while it answered many of the questions that had haunted Daemon and Lyra for 5 long years, brought with it no easy sense of resolution. Betrayal, they were both learning, rarely offered clean endings, even when the truth finally came fully into the light. But it did offer something crucial that had been missing for half a decade, the certainty that the shadow hunting their family finally had a name, a face, and soon, a formal reckoning that would ensure it could never threaten them again. The formal council session convened 3 days later, a somber, tense affair, attended by every senior member of the Crimson Moon Pack, gathered in the Great Hall, to witness the judgment of a man who had served among them for 15 years before his betrayal came to light. Daemon presided over the proceedings with careful, deliberate authority, allowing Edmund Farrow the chance to speak fully in his own defense, though little the older man offered did much to soften the severity of his crimes. Lyra sat beside Daemon throughout the proceedings, her presence itself a quiet, powerful statement to the assembled council about where the pack's future truly stood. Ren remained elsewhere in the castle, cared for by trusted staff, shielded as much as possible from the heavier realities of what her family had endured, though Daemon suspected, given his daughter's sharp and observant nature, that she understood more of the situation than anyone had explicitly told her. The council's judgment, when it came, stripped Edmund Farrow of his position and standing within the pack entirely, exiling him from Crimson Moon territory, with the clear understanding that any attempt to return, or any further involvement in schemes against the royal family, would be met with the full and final weight of pack law. It was not the harshest punishment available under their traditions, but Damon had chosen mercy over vengeance in the end, reasoning that a man stripped of all power and influence, watched carefully by allied territories who had been informed of his betrayal, posed less ongoing danger than a martyr with nothing left to lose. The remaining agent who had escaped into the forest during the attempted kidnapping was never fully located, though word eventually reached Crimson Moon territory, weeks later, that a man matching his description had been apprehended attempting to cross into a neighboring territory under a false name, taken into custody by local authorities on unrelated charges. Damon arranged, through careful diplomatic channels, to have the man extradited and questioned, ultimately confirming that, with Edmund Farrow's network fully dismantled and exposed, the broader conspiracy against Lyra and Wren had been thoroughly unraveled, its remaining pieces scattered and rendered harmless. For the first time in 5 years, Lyra allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that the danger which had once driven her into hiding was truly, finally over. The weeks following Edmund's exile brought a different kind of adjustment to the castle, one measured not in danger and investigation, but in the slower, more delicate work of building a family, and a future neither Damon nor Lyra had ever expected to have the chance to construct. Wren settled further into her new life, her initial fear from the kidnapping attempt gradually giving way to the same fearless curiosity that had defined her from the very beginning. Though Damon noticed, she had grown somewhat more cautious around strangers, a small, understandable scar left by the ordeal that he hoped, with time and safety, would eventually fade. He and Lyra, meanwhile, found themselves navigating the complicated, tender work of rebuilding trust and intimacy after 5 years apart. Years that had changed them both, in ways neither could fully articulate, but both could feel, in the careful, sometimes hesitant way they moved around each other. There were long conversations late into the night, working through the grief and anger and relief that had accumulated over half a decade of separation. Conversations that sometimes ended in tears, and sometimes, gradually, in the easy laughter that had once defined their relationship before everything fell apart. Damon found himself, more than once, simply watching her across a room, marveling at the strength it must have taken to survive 5 years of hiding alone, while raising a child who had grown into someone so bright and fearless, despite the uncertainty surrounding her entire early life. He had spent 5 years believing she had chosen to leave him, and now, faced with the full truth of what she had actually endured, he found his admiration for her deepening, in ways that went far beyond the love he had already carried for so long. Lyra, for her part, found herself slowly releasing the constant, watchful tension she had carried for 5 years, the instinct to always have an exit route planned, to always keep a portion of herself guarded against the possibility of sudden danger. It did not disappear entirely, not after everything she had survived, but within the walls of Crimson Moon territory, surrounded by a pack that had welcomed her and her daughter with genuine warmth once the truth became known. She began, cautiously, to believe that she and Wren might finally be allowed to simply live, without the constant shadow of fear hanging over every quiet moment. The pack itself, once the full story became known, embraced Lyra and Wren with a warmth that surprised her, having spent 5 years imagining herself as an outsider unworthy of the position she had once been poised to hold. Word spread quickly through the territory of everything she had sacrificed, the danger she had faced alone while pregnant, the years she had spent protecting the king's heir, through nothing but her own resourcefulness and determination, and rather than judgment, she found herself met, again and again, with genuine respect and welcome, from people who recognized the strength her survival had required. Wren, meanwhile, was rapidly becoming something of a beloved figure throughout the castle, her bright energy and fearless curiosity winning over staff and pack members alike, and Damon found himself watching, with a fierce, protective pride he had never fully anticipated feeling, as his daughter began to grow into the role that would one day be hers, learning pack traditions, forming friendships with other children her age, and slowly, gradually, coming to understand the significance of the heritage she had been born into, but never known until now. One evening, several weeks after Edmund's exile, Damon found Lyra sitting alone in the Healing House garden, the same garden she had once fled through 5 years earlier, tending quietly to the herbs that grew there. He approached slowly, giving her space to notice him before he spoke, and settled onto the bench beside her, watching the last light of evening paint the sky in soft shades of gold and orange. "I keep thinking," he said quietly, "about everything you carried alone. 5 years of running, of hiding, of raising her with no one to share the weight with. I do not know how you managed it." Lyra was quiet for a long moment, her hands still working through the herbs in front of her, before she finally answered. "I did not always believe I could manage it," she admitted. "There were nights I was certain I had made the wrong choice, that I should have found some way to tell you, to trust that we could face the danger together, rather than me facing it alone. But every morning, I woke up and Ren needed me, and there was no space left for doubt, only for whatever needed to be done that day to keep her safe." Damon reached over, taking her hand gently, and this time, she did not pull away. "You do not have to carry anything alone anymore," he said, the words carrying the weight of a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life. "Whatever comes next, whatever challenges this pack faces, we face them together. That is not a debt I am asking you to repay. It is simply the truth of what I want, what I have always wanted, since the very first moment I knew you." Lyra turned to look at him fully, and in her eyes, Damon saw something he had feared. During the darkest days of the past 5 years, he might never see again, the same warmth and certainty that had once made him believe, without any doubt at all, that he had found the person he wanted to build his entire life around. "I want that too," she said softly. "I have wanted that every single day since I left, even when I believed it was impossible." The garden around them fell into comfortable silence, broken only by the distant sound of Ren's laughter, drifting from somewhere inside the castle. A bright, joyful sound that seemed, in that quiet golden moment, to promise that whatever difficulties still lay ahead, the family they were slowly rebuilding had finally found solid ground to stand on. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Crimson Moon territory in a thick layer of snow that transformed the castle grounds into something out of one of the stories Damon had once told Ren around campfires during their journey home from Elwood Cross. The girl, delighted by her first proper winter within Packlands, spent her days building elaborate, lopsided snow structures with the other children of the territory, her laughter ringing clear and bright across grounds that had, for 5 long years, felt far too quiet. It was during this season of settling snow and slowly mending hearts that Damon began quietly preparing for something he had been considering since the very night Edmund Farrow's betrayal had finally come fully into the light. He approached the matter carefully, first consulting with Colin and a handful of his most trusted advisors. Then, once he felt certain of the path forward, bringing the idea to Lyra herself on a quiet evening by the fire in his private chambers, Ren already asleep in the room down the hall that had, over the past months, become unmistakably hers. "I want to formally claim you as my mate before the entire pack," he said, watching her face carefully as he spoke, wanting to gauge her reaction honestly, rather than assuming what she might want after everything they had both endured. "And I want to name Ren as my heir, publicly and permanently, so that no one within this territory or beyond it can ever again mistake her place in this family, or attempt to use her uncertain status as a weapon against us." Lyra was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, and Damon found himself holding his breath, uncertain whether the request felt like healing or like pressure after everything she had survived. "Are you certain?" she asked finally. "This is not merely about correcting the record, about undoing what Edmund tried to take from us. I do not want you making this choice from a place of obligation or guilt over the years we lost." Damon reached for her hand, holding it firmly, wanting her to feel the certainty behind every word he spoke next. "I am certain," he said, "because I have never once, in 5 years, stopped wanting this exact thing. Every match my council proposed, I refused, not out of stubbornness, but because none of them were you. I do not want this because of what Edmund did or did not take from us. I want this because you are, and have always been, the only person I have ever wanted standing beside me as I lead this pack. Ren is simply the extraordinary, unexpected gift that came from loving you as completely as I always have." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, though this time, unlike so many of the tears she had shed over the past 5 years, these carried nothing but relief and quiet, overwhelming joy. "Then yes," she said softly. "I want that too. I have wanted it since long before I ever had to run." The ceremony, when it finally took place several weeks later, drew every member of the Crimson Moon Pack together in the Great Hall, decorated for the occasion with evergreen boughs and warm firelight that pushed back against the winter chill outside. Lyra stood beside Damon at the center of the hall, dressed simply but beautifully, her dark hair loose around her shoulders in a style that reminded several of the older pack members present of the woman they remembered from years before her disappearance, though something in her bearing now carried a depth and strength that had not been there previously, forged through 5 years of hardship she had ultimately survived and overcome. Ren stood between her parents, dressed in a small formal gown that she had declared, with characteristic bluntness, to be entirely too fussy, though her golden eyes shone with unmistakable excitement as Damon knelt before her, taking both her small hands in his in front of the assembled pack. "Ren Ashworth Voss," he said, using the full name they had agreed upon together, honoring both the mother who had raised her alone and the father who claimed her fully now. "I name you before this entire pack as my daughter and my heir, the future of Crimson Moon territory, protected and cherished by every soul within these walls from this day forward." The pack's response was immediate and overwhelming, a roar of approval and celebration that shook the rafters of the Great Hall, and Ren, apparently deciding that the formal solemnity of the moment had gone on quite long enough, threw her arms around her father's neck, with the same fearless enthusiasm she brought to everything, drawing warm laughter from the crowd that dissolved any remaining formality into genuine, joyful celebration. Damon rose, lifting his daughter easily into his arms, and turned to Lyra, whose face was streaked with tears she made no effort to hide, tears that belonged entirely to happiness, rather than the grief and fear that had defined so much of the past 5 years. "Before this pack, and before the memory of every hardship that tried to keep us apart," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I claim Lyra Ashworth as my true mate and queen, not because tradition demands it, but because she has proven, through 5 years of sacrifice and strength that few could match, exactly why she has always belonged at my side." The celebration that followed lasted long into the night, the great hall filled with music and laughter, and the particular warmth that comes from an entire community, witnessing the mending of something that had once seemed permanently broken. Lyra moved through the crowd with Damon's hand steady in hers, accepting congratulations and warm welcomes from pack members who, only months earlier, had known nothing of her existence, and Ren darted between the legs of adults and the company of new friends, with an energy that seemed determined to make up for every quiet, isolated evening of her first 5 years. Late in the evening, once the celebration had begun to wind down, and Ren had finally fallen asleep, exhausted and happy, in Colin's steady arms, while the adults finished their final rounds of quiet conversation, Damon found a moment alone with Lyra, near the Great Hall's tall windows, looking out over snow-covered grounds bathed in moonlight. "5 years," he said quietly, "is a long time to lose. I cannot promise I have fully made peace with everything that time cost us. Cost Ren. Cost you most of all." Lyra leaned against him, her head resting against his shoulder, watching the same moonlit snow he was watching. "Perhaps we do not need to make full peace with it," she said. "Perhaps it is enough to simply carry it forward as part of our story, proof of what we survived, rather than a wound we pretend never happened. What matters now is that we are here, together, and that whatever comes next, we face it as a family, rather than as 3 separate people, scattered by fear and distance." Damon pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, feeling, for the first time in 5 years, a sense of peace settle over him that felt solid and permanent, rather than fragile and fleeting. "Together," he agreed softly. "From this moment forward, always together." Outside, snow continued falling gently over Crimson Moon territory, blanketing a pack that had weathered betrayal and loss, and finally, after 5 long years of separation, found its way back to something whole. Inside the Great Hall, firelight flickered warm against the walls, illuminating a family reunited against every obstacle that had tried to keep them apart. A king who had never stopped searching, a mother who had never stopped protecting, and a daughter whose fearless, golden-eyed spirit had ultimately been the thread that pulled all 3 of their scattered lives back together. The Alpha King had discovered the truth almost too late, 5 years too late, by every measure that mattered, but not, in the end, too late to build the future he had once feared he had lost forever. Some truths, however long they take to surface, arrive exactly when they are needed most, and some families, however deeply broken, find their way back to wholeness when love and courage refuse to give up the search.